All right, y'all, we're picking back up. We're going to finish reading this chapter of Medical Apartheid. I did quickly want to pull up my bioethics textbook. This is chapter 3, Dilemmas in the Patient-Provider Relationship. I'm not going to go over the opening like gambit, just describing the scenario that they're further breaking down in relation to autonomy and beneficence, which I know it's like beneficence or whatever, but I say beneficence. But essentially what's happening here is a patient was given, a sleeping pill to which, they're claiming she became dependent or addicted. They replaced that without her knowledge and with a placebo. And, hoping or banking on her not noticing. She was being charged for it, even though it was a nominal amount. And she eventually noticed it and asked about it. And now it's kind of like, well, what's the downside of them informing her of what this is and where it's coming from? Or should they continue to lie or make her believe that it's the same medication, what have you? And so that's what they're asserting here, is that there's a problem with informed consent. And it's this clash between duty to autonomy, your right to make decisions, and beneficence, their right to kind of respect that. And so that's what's kind of being grappled with here in this chapter. And let me see here. Let me find one moment. Okay, here it is. I wanted to kind of like get to the point. And also when it comes to beneficence, they can essentially practice this by violating this. But a part of this, because it is with regard to this sort of moral obligation that these providers have to act in your best interest. And so in many cases, doing so is honoring this, but then there are times such as this where it's not. And so then it becomes this sort of risk. Just wanted to clarify that. But it says here, the worry, however, is that she will feel betrayed and not trust either doctor that she's been working with. So the alternative is for the nurse to continue to keep Miss Lightman in the dark, upholding the benefit of SequelCap while violating her autonomy. He does not have to tell her an outright falsehood. So this is how they negotiate with, this sort of concept of a white lie. He could claim that SequelCap is an alternative to Seconal as a sleep aid, which is true, but it is surely not the whole truth. So you see, when I mentioned in the other video, when it comes to first do no harm and how legally they can render that a truth through the language that is used and through the systems that are set up. So this is how insidious and intricate this stuff becomes. It's like, how can we manipulate this situation in our favor? And so yeah, I just wanted to briefly kind of go into that, but let's delve back in here. Let's see, where do we leave off? Here. Yeah. Okay. So, but is this characterization supported by facts? How often do the bodies of poor, the homeless, the friendless, or those who, like Yagan, simply look that way to medical personnel end up on anatomy tables? What role has race played in such events yesterday and today in our 21st century? The short answer is that the bodies of foundational Black Americans and Africans as well were once at the highest risk of being used for anatomy. In many areas, the majority of cadavers in research and dissection laboratories were Black, but today that risk has shrunk dramatically for foundational Black Americans. Experts claim that mostly white bodies are used today, but they can produce no good ethnic national data to quantify this. We're right. Because the Uniform Anatomical Gift Act of 1968 provides for the distribution of, my goodness, a law, an act, providing for the distribution of unclaimed bodies to medical schools and other public and private consumers God knows what this means, of human cadavers and tissue, but there is a lot of money in that, much like the private slave traders, slave stealers. And because majority groups are overrepresented among the poor and homeless who constitute the bulk of these bodies, all indications suggest that Black bodies are still more likely than whites to populate dissection laboratories. Indeed. And I mean, as it stands today, just because that is the case, I'm not saying that it's, it's not potentially more white bodies. Because when you look at the drug crisis today with, oh gosh, and it's just escaped my mind. What is that, fentanyl? A lot of those people taking that tend to be of this particular race. And so they would kind of fall under this, right? But again, it's still disproportionate. In many cases, it's still disproportionate. However, the historical data are unambiguous and reveal a long-standing preference for foundational Black American bodies, which suggests that the fears of many foundational Black Americans emanate from an ugly historical tradition, not from overly fertile imaginations. Many Champ's fears about experiments may well have been misplaced, but they were not baseless. They reflected a failure to distinguish the frankly abusive dangers of yesterday from the narrower hazards of today. Until the last century, American medical practitioners shared a deep frustration with much of Europe. Anatomical dissection had become key to physician training, but because the procurement of cadavers and often dissection itself was illegal and socially unacceptable, doctors and their porters had to employ a macabre creativity leavened with criminal force to secure the bodies of the recently deceased for dissection. All right, y'all, it's okay. We can look. Oh, hold on, this isn't the same. I'm thinking I'm still here where I can highlight a word and like look up the definition. All right. Oh, wrong thing. Whoa, what's going on? Oh, let me finish uploading this, y'all. This is the first part of this. Okay, that's a big word. We're gonna have to look this up. Describe something gruesome, horrifying, ghastly, typically focused on death, decay, or injury. Okay, cool. All right, these bodies tended to be Black. The attitudes of white Southerners both toward the use of human bodies in medical education and towards Blacks were silently but clearly revealed in the medical profession's heavy reliance on Negro cadavers, observed Todd L. Savitt. Hospitals habitually delivered Black bodies directly from the wards to the autopsy tables without asking anyone's consent. Today, the legacy of this post-mortem racism survives in policies that continue to appropriate the bodies of friendless paupers, such as the homeless, a disproportionate number of whom are Black, for medical purposes. And you see, like in places like California, where there are efforts being made to financially back certain communities like the Asian community in the prevention of homelessness, while homelessness affecting foundational Black Americans is at an all-time high. It's sickening, and that's just one place. I'm sure it's happening elsewhere. Medical educators hold that dissection is necessary because students must familiarize themselves with the human body before they treat living patients. And mind you, there are a lot of advances in technology, 3D printing, what have you, where they can create simulations of different parts of the body to be dissected. You don't need per se that, but, and they also have animals. So I'm trying to think of other living organisms. But I mean, to a degree, it really isn't the same. So at some point you kind of do need that experience. But the point I'm trying to make here is that the demand of that need is not so great that if things were set up in good faith, that those electing to donate their remains to science wouldn't be sufficient. Do you get what I'm saying? For those who are needing this sort of practice. Anyway, who, they asked, would wish to be treated by a doctor who would never personally investigate and familiarize herself with the human body. However, recent studies show that fewer people are donating their bodies for medical education. And in 2004 Johns Hopkins report, only 49%, so we're already, coming into modern times. I mean, definitely in modern times, but y'all get what I'm saying. Only 49% of those surveyed said they would consider donating their bodies. Worse, up to 70% fewer foundational Black Americans said they would donate. Race and education were the most important determinants. Because again, their preference is for foundational Black American bodies. Black bodies. African American literacy was still widely outlawed and remained low in affected communities until the early 20th century. So witnesses spread the information about this exploitation of Black bodies via oral traditions that alerted others to the danger, but sometimes exaggerated its extent. And I do want to also say, because like I said, anywhere I see African American, I'm going to say foundational Black American, but this also includes those who are, first generation African here, and those in the Caribbean. I mean, melanated people really, but more so those categorized as Black for sure. Word of mouth spread the reputation of hospitals and medical schools, which were not typically affiliated with hospitals until the middle of the 19th century, as repositories for Black bodies that had been stolen under cover of darkness by night doctors for use in medical dissection rooms and laboratories. This oral tradition is frequently dismissed as old wives' tales and superstition because tales of the theft of Black bodies sound fantastic to many whites and to African Americans who pride themselves on their scientific sophistication. Many people assume that belief in the theft of Black bodies is paranoia born of a violently racist history. So again, it's this way that people cope with this sort of cognitive dissonance and reality of the horrors of this act that indeed goes on and has gone on for a very, very long time. And it's sort of intoxicating when you are granted into these cadaver labs and into these spaces and you're going up the rungs and going through the process to become a licensed health professional, and everything looks nice and smells sterile, and you're given all these benefits and access to this and that. You kind of become puffed up, you kind of you start feeling yourself and not realizing that what is fueling all of this, what is underneath all of this, are some of the darkest, most horrific realities and suffering and pools upon pools of blood. And it's crazy. And so, how do you grapple with that? How do you maintain this sort of romanticized viewpoint, this sort of Grey's Anatomy viewpoint of an industry that is built on something so horrific and continues to be fueled on something so horrific? But Janie Gaines and Sarah Cox know from experience that Black cadavers tend to disappear. In January 1998, the sisters frowned as they surveyed the crumbling headstones, trash, and tangled weeds strangling Greenwood, the Birmingham, Alabama cemetery in which their family had long ago laid their sister, Addie Mae Collins. Although most Americans do not know her name, Addie Mae is a national icon of sorts. The 13-year-old was a martyr of the Civil Rights Movement, one of 4 girls who were murdered in the 1963 bombing of Birmingham's 16th Street Baptist Church a few days after the city's schools were integrated. Martin Luther King Jr. eulogized her, and her tombstone bears the rousing inscription, "She died so freedom might live." It was 30 years, before her sisters could bear to visit her grave. I know, because I still haven't been able to go to my mom or aunt's grave. It's just too much. And when they saw its neglected state, they immediately arranged to have Addie Mae moved to another, better maintained cemetery. Thankfully, I have family that goes, to check on it. But, however, workers who opened the grave recoiled in shock. It was empty, devoid of casket and corpse. Addie Mae's body, like so many buried in Black cemeteries throughout the South, and that's why I emphasize foundational Black American, is missing. No one can know with certainty who took the body or why, but many are convinced that her body joined the untold thousands of anonymous Black cadavers on anonymous tables. That Addie Mae's fate is far from unique, was driven home by a grisly 1989 discovery during a breathlessly hot August in Augusta, Georgia. Construction workers renovating a stately 154-year-old Greek revival structure that once housed the Medical College of Georgia stumbled upon a nightmare cached beneath the building. Strewn beneath its concrete floor lay a chaos of desiccated body parts and nearly 10,000 human bones and skulls, many bearing the marks of 19th century anatomy tools or numbered with Indian ink. The cool, sunless basement had preserved the remains remarkably well. Bones and human dissected material, quote-unquote, littered the floors, metal tubs, and even latrines. Ossified human remains spilled from broken vats that had once held cadavers preserved in alcohol. Jars held fetal organs in vanishing lakes of whiskey, an indication that scientists had displayed the purloined bodies using the alcohol as a preservative in addition to dissecting them. Because not only grave robbing, but also anatomical dissection were illegal in Georgia until 1887. There was no legal source of such bodies. They were stolen in a manner that outraged decency and violated the law. This disarticulated nightmare was all that remained of faceless people whose bodies had been dissected, then unceremoniously scattered in the basement and amid a jumble of broken syringes, microscope slides, scalpels, old pill bottles, and other medical detritus. As years passed, medical personnel covered each stratum of human refuse with quick lime to quell the stench, and later the basement was cemented over. Scientists determined that most of the remains dated from the 19th century, and detailed analyses of the bones and surrounding materials revealed that 75% of the bones in the basement were those of foundational Black Americans, although Blacks constituted only 42% of the area's population. The late Robert Blakely, then chair of the Georgia State University's Department of Anthropology, gathered a multidisciplinary team, which later reported on almost every scientific and humanistic approach to analyzing the 9,800 human bones that MCG had used between 1835 and 1912. The ethnically diverse, one-third foundational Black American scientific team included medical doctors, archaeologists, anthropologists, medical historians, anatomists, biochemists, population geneticists, nutritionists, and even folklorists who analyzed a great deal of information about the subject's bodies, lives, and cultures from the MCG remains. They determined age from the age-specific growth and fusing of bones such as sutures of the skull and wrist bones, the angle of pelvic bones and bone thicknesses and ratios revealed gender, many physiological and medical methods certified racial identification. The separate lives of Black and whites in the mid-19th century South provided much of the definitive racial data. Black and whites ate different diets, wore different clothes, suffered from different disorders, worked at different occupations, took different medications, and died from different diseases and disorders, many of which left their marks on bones. Area residents, Black and white, were also questioned about their knowledge and beliefs concerning the school's activities. This inclusive approach allowed the scientists to do more than interpret medical truths. They also listened to the previously voiceless foundational Black American victims of body stealing. Via interviews and questionnaires, Blacks finally were able to contribute their perspective to the historical record. The basement was filled with mostly Black bodies, not by accident, but by design. As the 19th century progressed, doctors' needs for cadavers for medical education and training surged, but dissection was abhorrent, a shameful fate reserved for the most heinous criminals who received a double sentence of execution and dissection. As a result, physicians appropriated the bodies of enslaved persons with no legal rights of those of free Blacks, with no rights that a white man was obligated to respect. The bodies in the basement had been spirited by night from the graveyard, but not from just any graveyard. Most were taken from Cedar Grove Cemetery, a foundational Black American burial ground. We know this for several reasons. Physiological, anthropological, and nutritional assessments of the bones and other remains established that 3/4 of them came from Blacks, and Cedar Grove had held Black bodies exclusively since the Civil War. Since its founding, Black Augusta residents had consistently complained of grave robbing there. Also, the college's 4 and 5 porters had all named the Black cemetery in their periodic reports on the provenance of the cadavers they provided to students each term. In a 1908 lecture to the students, for example, Porter Grandison Harris described his techniques and named Cedar Grove as his milieu. Other witness accounts verified this, such that MCG professor Eugene Murphy, MD, whose 1938 memoirs describe how he accompanied Harris to Cedar Grove as a young medical student seeking bodies. Half a century later, the MCG scientific assessment helped to validate Blacks' tales of night doctors who reaped ram harvest in Black cemeteries. The school's dissection tables, and finally its basement, became their victims' only resting places. But the basement lacked even the minimal dignity of the meanest grave. It was devoid of placards, headstones, personal effects, or, this is about to mess me up, funerary artifacts making the social worth, or even the very presence of the dead. There had been no attempt to identify the bones nor to arrange the remains in any attitude of dignity. Instead, they lay amid broken glassware, food containers, patient medicine bottles, and even the remains of vivisected animals, just another heap of discarded training material. At first blush, robbing Black graveyards to fill white anatomist laboratories appears a purely racial issue. But men like Grandison Harris complicated the picture because they were Black. In 1852, the MCG bought the 36-year-old Harris, a strapping, muscular native of the Gullah Islands, on a South Carolina slave auction block for $700. The school had not purchased a strong man just to clean its floors. His chief duty was to rob graves. And so, yeah, we see that a lot of people participating in these systems in some way or another are forced to become complicit for survival. It's not that they have to choose to do that, but my goodness, it gets so deep. And I really think that's where things are headed. If we can use people who look like them, people who come from them, against them, then in some way they think that they've won or become, non-responsible. Y'all, it gets so deep. But I wanted to find. And that is horrible. And he should really be ashamed of himself. Terrible. Let's see. I wanted to find, because this is kind of a lot. We don't have time to read through all this, but I wanted to find where she talks about the 20th century. Yeah, so we know that, as it arrived and progressed, the disparities still persisted, even through to the 21st century. Really what's changed is just the legalities of it all and the ways in which they would procure these bodies of people. Maybe not so much from graves anymore, unfortunately, through trafficking, through kidnapping, through, you going into the hospital hoping to get through these quote-unquote pandemics that come up, and shut things down. And then, you're given access to these facilities and none of your family is allowed to come in there with you and no one's allowed to be in there with you. And then next thing you know, people are losing their lives who weren't truly on the verge of losing their lives, or you are administered some sort of jab or injection that causes you to lose your life. This new sort of experimental thing, the side effects of which we know truly nothing about. It takes over a decade to really know the ramification and impact on most injectable medications. It takes a long time before a real decision can be made with regard to whether or not it is truly safe. But who has time for that, right? And like we saw in other videos, the people seeking to benefit, the families seeking to benefit and profit, the nation seeking to benefit and profit, the companies, all the things, off of these products, they don't have time to wait for a study here and a study that, what? No. You are the study. It's not funny, but you are the study. Just as we see with Tuskegee. What is it, 30, 40 year long study, all against their will, all being lied to. But again, like we see, if I give you something that causes you to be dependent or whatever, at that point it affects your competence, if not that, your capacity. And so when it comes to any decisions for your health, I don't know, I don't think you have the ability to make decisions. We know the side effects of what we're giving you, and that it's going to cause this, and that, this dependency. But then we still victim blame and make you the problem. And then we change things up and subject you to consuming or taking something you have no knowledge of. But it's really because, we're looking out for you, right? We're looking out for your best interest, okay? Because we really care. Even though what we did really wasn't an act of care, we care. And because we care, we're going to continue to lie to you and uphold whatever might violate your autonomy, because at the end of the day, it's really not this outright falsehood. I mean, we're not completely lying to you, even though we're not telling you the whole truth. It's not a total lie, So, I mean, just off of this half-truth, you are adequately informed. But I don't know. I don't think you have the competence. It becomes this whole thing where at the end of the day, I mean, gosh, don't even get me started on dialysis. Good gracious. Whew! At the end of the day, how can we be ethical in our decision to violate the rights of people subject in this relationship? How much can we get away with and it be okay? All to advance science. Remember the video we watched, right? All these plant hunters and what have you. I mean, they're really interested in making scientific efforts to save mankind. So you should be grateful, because, I mean, without all of these bodies, we wouldn't be where we are today to be able to save your life. This had to happen. Yeah, they needed to suffer. These people needed to go through this, even after death. We haven't even gotten to people that are alive and suffering in these facilities. And you really believe that things have changed that much? I don't know. If it ain't broke, don't fix it, right? But if it causes outrage, just spruce it up a little bit. This is what we're up against. And many of you know that, but it's worth going into the records, into the data, to really just confirm what many of us already know, unfortunately.